I did not see it coming. Not the divorce, not the courtroom, not the moment a woman I had never spoken to stood up in front of a judge and said 4 words that stopped the entire room cold. This does not add up. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 61 years old, a retired school librarian from Cedar Grove, Ohio. And for nearly 17 years, I believed I was married to an honest man. I was wrong. Not in the way you might think. There was no affair, no second family hiding in another city. What Ethan had been hiding was quieter than that, more deliberate, and in some ways far more devastating, because it didn't start when our marriage began falling apart. It started years before I ever noticed anything was wrong. The morning of the hearing, I walked into that courthouse believing I was there to sign papers and say goodbye. I had no idea that before the day ended, a 60-second voicemail, a business address nobody could explain, and one woman doing her job a little too carefully would unravel something Ethan had spent years building in silence. I also had no idea that the person who finally pulled the thread wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a judge, wasn't a private investigator I had hired. It was a paralegal intern who had been sitting quietly in the corner of that courtroom all morning, reviewing documents no one else had bothered to cross-reference. Nobody was watching her, including me. What she found didn't just expose a secret, it exposed a pattern. And once I understood the pattern, every odd moment from the past 5 years suddenly made sense. The financial documents he couldn't locate, the questions he answered too quickly, the address that appeared on 3 years of payments connected to a business I had never heard of. This story is about what happened when the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. It is also about something I wish I had understood much earlier. Your instincts are not paranoia. They are information. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop explaining them away. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I remember it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just the quiet, steady kind of rain that makes everything feel slower than it should. I was standing by the kitchen window when I saw the envelope appear in my mailbox. Plain white, no return address I recognized. I already knew what it was. Ethan had warned me it was coming. He used words like respectful and mature and no need for things to get ugly. And at first, I believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was the man I had eaten breakfast with for 17 years. The man who remembered how I took my coffee, who called me from grocery stores to ask if we needed anything. Respectful seemed possible. What I did not expect was how cooperative he would become once the papers were filed. He offered to handle most of the documentation himself, said he wanted to make things easier on me, said he didn't want lawyers turning something sad into something bitter. And I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking, at least we are ending this with some dignity. But somewhere underneath that gratitude, something else was sitting quietly, something I kept pushing down every time it rose to the surface. Because the more helpful Ethan became, the more a small voice in the back of my mind kept asking the same question. Why is he in such a hurry? I ignored it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that 17 years of a good marriage didn't vanish without reason, and maybe I had simply missed the signs. I spent weeks going over old conversations in my head, looking for the moment things changed, looking for what I had done wrong. It wasn't until I met with my attorney, Rebecca Lawson, 1 week before the hearing, that the question I had been avoiding finally found its shape. Rebecca spread several financial documents across her desk, studied them for a moment, and then looked up at me and asked, very calmly,
"Claire, are you absolutely certain there are no other accounts you don't know about?" I laughed. I actually laughed. And then I heard myself say, "Ethan always handled most of the investments, but we were always transparent with each other." The moment those words left my mouth, I realized I had no idea if they were true. Rebecca didn't push, but that night I went home and I started pulling out old files, tax returns, insurance records, mortgage statements. Most of it looked exactly as I expected, and then I found a payment, small enough to overlook, consistent enough to mean something, attached to an address I had never seen before. When I asked Ethan about it the next morning, he smiled, said it was probably an old administrative error, and changed the subject so smoothly I almost didn't notice he had never actually answered me. Almost. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a door you thought was locked turns out to have been open the whole time. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something personal. Has there ever been a moment in your life when your gut told you something was wrong, but the person you trusted most made you feel like you were imagining it? It doesn't have to be a marriage. It could be a friendship, a family member, a workplace situation. I spent years second-guessing myself because someone I loved was very good at making my instincts feel like overreactions. If that sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. I genuinely read them. And if this story is resonating with you so far, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next, because what was discovered inside that courtroom changed everything.
The morning of the hearing, I woke up at 5:15, not because of an alarm, just because my body had apparently decided that sleep was no longer something I deserved. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, went over everything Rebecca had told me the night before. She had said to stay calm. She had said that let her handle the talking. She had said that divorce hearings at this stage were mostly procedural, paperwork, signatures, a judge asking routine questions that everyone already knew the answers to. I told myself she was right. I told myself it would be over in a few hours and I could start figuring out what the rest of my life looked like. I was wrong on both counts. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, chairs that looked like they had been uncomfortable since 1987. Ethan was already seated when I arrived. Dark suit, calm expression. He looked exactly the way he always looked when he had already decided how a situation was going to go. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through a folder with the practiced boredom of someone who had done this 1,000 times. For the first hour, everything moved exactly the way Rebecca had described. Documents were presented, numbers were reviewed, the judge asked questions, attorneys responded. I sat quietly and tried to look like a woman who had everything under control. And then something happened that nobody in that room had scheduled. A court-appointed financial counselor named Margaret Osei had been assigned to review the disclosure statements connected to our assets. She was methodical, thorough in a way that felt almost bureaucratic. At one point, she paused mid-page, went back, looked at something again, then looked at something in a separate file. The room didn't notice at first, but I noticed, because the pause lasted a little too long, and when she finally looked up, she didn't look at either attorney. She looked directly at the judge and said, "There appears to be an inconsistency in these filings that I think requires clarification." Ethan's attorney immediately objected, said it was likely a clerical error, said these things happened all the time in complex financial disclosures. The judge overruled him without hesitating. Margaret was asked to continue. What she had found was an address,
a business address that appeared in 3 separate financial documents but had never been listed in any of our joint disclosures, not in our tax conversations, not in our retirement planning, not anywhere. It was the same address I had found connected to those quiet, consistent payments in our old records, the same address Ethan had called an administrative error and moved past before I could ask a follow-up question. Ethan's expression didn't collapse. It didn't do anything dramatic, but I had spent 17 years learning the geometry of that face, and for the first time all morning, something shifted behind his eyes. Just slightly, just enough. The judge requested additional documentation connected to the address. Ethan's attorney objected again. The judge overruled him again. There was a recess while new records were retrieved. I sat in that hard chair and looked at the fluorescent lights and felt something strange moving through me. Not anger, not satisfaction, something quieter. The feeling you get when a word you've been trying to remember for days finally surfaces, like something that was always there had simply been waiting for the right moment to become visible. When court resumed, Margaret requested permission to present one additional piece of evidence that had surfaced during the document review. A voicemail, 60 seconds long, a routine business message left on a number registered to that same address, a number that had never appeared in any filing connected to our marriage. The recording was not dramatic, no shouting, no confession, just a man's voice referencing a meeting, a date, and a financial arrangement. But the date he mentioned was 3 weeks before Ethan first told me he wanted a divorce, and the financial arrangement he referenced involved an account that had never appeared anywhere in 17 years of our shared records. By the time the recording ended, Ethan had stopped looking at anyone in the room. His attorney was already leaning toward him, speaking in a low voice. Rebecca was writing something quickly on her notepad, and the judge was asking questions that no longer sounded routine. The hearing that was supposed to take 3 hours was recessed until further notice. A full forensic review of all financial records was ordered before any settlement could proceed. Ethan's request for an expedited divorce was denied. As people began filing out, he finally looked at me. I thought maybe he would say something. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment and then said very quietly, "You weren't supposed to find out this way." I looked at him for a few seconds before I answered. "I know," I said. "You were hoping I wouldn't find out at all." He didn't deny it. I want to stop here and ask you something, because I think about this often. When someone finally gets caught after hiding something for years, do you think they feel relief or regret? I ask because of the look on Ethan's face when that recording finished playing. It wasn't the face of someone who felt caught. It was the face of someone who was exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long. I'm not excusing what he did, but I've thought about that expression a lot in the months since. If you've ever watched someone get exposed and wondered what was really going on behind their eyes, tell me in the comments. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story about trusting their instincts before it's too late, share this with them today. The next is where everything that was uncovered during that forensic review finally comes to light, and I'll be honest with you, even I was not prepared for the full picture.
The forensic review took 6 months. I know that sounds like a long time, but when you have spent 17 years building a life with someone, 6 months to understand what was actually real inside that life felt almost reasonable. I kept myself busy, ever fully understanding why. And slowly, as the investigators worked through layer after layer of financial records, the picture that emerged was not what I had imagined during any of those sleepless nights before the hearing. It was more calculated than that.
Ethan had not made impulsive decisions. He had not panicked and hidden money during a rough patch. What the record showed was a pattern that stretched back nearly a decade. A small logistics business, registered under a variation of his middle name, operating out of that address, generating income that had never appeared in a single joint filing. Accounts opened quietly over years, funded through transactions small enough to avoid any automatic review. An attorney, separate from anyone connected to our marriage, who had been advising him on asset protection strategies since well before our relationship began showing any visible cracks. The total was not a number I had imagined. It was not tens of thousands. By the time the forensic accountants finished, the figure they presented to the court was just under $400,000 in assets that had existed entirely outside our shared financial life. $400,000, managed carefully, hidden consistently, for almost 10 years. When Rebecca called to tell me the final number, I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because I was devastated, because I finally understood the timeline. The divorce had not happened because Ethan stopped loving me. It had not happened because we had grown apart or become different people, or any of the quiet, dignified explanations he had offered to me and to everyone around us. The divorce was filed because one of the accounts had become harder to keep separate, because the business had grown to a size where a joint financial disclosure would have made concealment nearly impossible. He had not left the marriage, he had left before the walls closed in. The judge did not treat it as an oversight. The settlement was restructured entirely. Ethan was ordered to pay back a significant portion of what had been hidden. Several matters were referred to state financial regulators for further review. His attorney, the separate one, the one I hadn't known existed, quietly withdrew from the case 3 weeks before the final ruling. And Ethan? He called me once after everything was finalized. His voice sounded older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He apologized. Not with excuses, not with explanations, just a simple acknowledgement that he spent years protecting something that wasn't worth what it cost. When the call ended, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, and I waited to feel something dramatic: anger, triumph, grief, something with edges. Instead, what came was quieter than any of that. It was the feeling of setting down a weight I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing it was there. I sleep well now. I ask questions I would have talked myself out of asking before. I trust the small voice that says something is not adding up, not because I am suspicious of everyone, but because I finally understand that my instincts were never the problem. Ignoring them was. I want to ask you one final thing, and I mean this genuinely. If you found out that someone you loved had been living a secret life right beside you, what would hurt more, the money or the years of pretending? Think about that for a moment, then drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that trusting yourself is never the wrong choice. Sometimes one story, heard at the right moment, is enough to change everything.